Well, welcome everybody. I'm Paul Walpe. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics, and glad you all could make it tonight for this program, which is going to be absolutely fascinating. We were having a conversation at dinner before this, and the stories are riveting, and the reasons and the dynamics of these cases are riveting. The way we're going to work this tonight is we're going to ask each of our speakers to tell their story in 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll have some conversation up here, and then we should have plenty of time for audience participation and questions. So everybody should have a chance to voice their admiration and concern after we begin the program. This program was made possible because of a generous grant by Brian Shields, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, and is part of the Center for Ethics program, especially attached to our Masters of Bioethics program. So I want to thank Brian for, you're Brian. I want to thank Brian, it didn't work out. Thank Brian for making all of this possible. A few other quick thank yous to Natasha Leibowitz, who I don't know if she's in the room right at this moment, but she has been tireless in putting all of this together. There she is, Natasha. And Allison Keir, our events manager, who took care of all the arrangements. To Sam Weinstein and Josephine Jones, who are sitting at the front desk, so all of you interacted with them. And then finally, Jack Wayne, who's doing the videotaping. As you all know, these events don't happen without a lot of work in the background, and I always think it's important that we show our appreciation to the people who make it happen. So let's do that. All right, so I want to quickly introduce our three speakers for tonight, our three panelists. I'll start at the end. Dr. William LaCourte is a practicing geriatrician and doctor of internal medicine, graduated from Tulane, an okay Southern University, in 1974. He works at Cura Health Hospital in New Orleans. He has successfully blown the whistle multiple times of several pharmaceutical companies, laboratory companies, and medical equipment companies. Next to him is Brian Shields, who was the whistleblower in a massive case against Genentech and about the drug Tarceva, settled in June 2016. Brian was a pharmaceutical sales rep, as he'll tell you, and filed the lawsuit in 2011, which gives you a sense of the time span some of these may take. And I will let him tell you exactly what the nature of that lawsuit was. He's a graduate of Goizueta MBA program, which is why we're having it here. It's kind of a nod to his alma mater. He's from Staten Island. He lives in Savannah, and these days he works in software for pharmaceutical companies, so you can ask him about that. And then finally, next to me is Jeb White. Before I introduce him, I will tell you that one of the joys of being a professor is as you move through life, you meet people who then tell you, yeah, I took your course at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's what happened with Jeb. When we got on the Zoom about this meeting, Jeb said, I was at Penn and I took courses with you and other bioethics courses. So through bioethics, he was well trained to do what he does now, which is being one of the country's leading advocates for whistleblowers. He's represented the interests of whistleblowers before the United States Supreme Court and in lower courts throughout the country. He's been a whistleblower counsel in a variety of actions, with allegations ranging from fraudulent hospital systems to kickback schemes. He's testified in front of the Congress and in front of nearly a dozen legislative state bodies. He's penned amicus curiae briefs in 5 United States Supreme Court cases, has been advisor to the Department of Justice and other officials. He's the host of the YouTube show and podcast, Fraud in America. So those are our experts for today. And I'm going to start by asking you, Bill, to tell your story in about 10 to 15 minutes.
the first cases involved laboratories. I thought I could run a lab and be a doctor, but we have the best Congress money can buy, and they got to Pete Stark on the Ways and Means Committee, and it was interesting that people that gave him money tended to profit by the various Stark amendments. One of them was, if I owned a lab and referred to it, I had committed a federal crime. And then that was Stark 1, then they said you can't have an x-ray, you can't have durable medical equipment. So I tried to make it without my own patients, and I wound up going bankrupt. Rather than SmithKline had made me an offer they thought I couldn't refuse, which was, give us all your lab business and we won't sue you. My healthcare attorney said, well, that's a kickback, and if you do that, you're committing fraud. So I didn't give them the lab business. They did sue me, and I turned around and sued them under the Federal False Claims Act because they were doing tests that I never ordered. And the schemes involve sophistication where they know about the practice. And if you go back and you look at old healthcare shows, let's have an SMA 12. Well, an SMA 12 is sequential multiphasic analyzer where they let a computer will do all these tests, but because a computer does it, it shouldn't be more than $18. Well, SmithKline got smart and added iron binding, lipid, and magnesium. And so their SMA 12, we'd order it, and you'd wind up, the government would wind up paying about $70. And I knew that that was not what I'd ordered. And they found a way to infiltrate. They got into the nursing homes by offering free continuing education to the directors and nurses. And of course they'd go with this company because they needed continuing education for their license. So I had a subchapter S company. I presume some of you guys are business. I did that because it gave me a corporate veil. So they could never recover anything. They were just trying to be nasty. So I turned around, and at the end of the day, they wound up paying $325 million. And that was interesting because I did let Medicare know about the problem in '92, and I told them all the labs that were doing it, but I didn't put it in the four corners of a Ketan complaint. I then became famous because I wasn't the first to file. And it's a highly technical field. And if anyone's crazy enough to do this, I suggest you would get somebody that's experienced. So we had $50 million to divide among 6 relators. They divided us into 2 groups of 3. One group got the money, the other group got nothing. I wound up in the group that got nothing because I wasn't the first to file, but at least I became famous. And so if you go to the law books, you'll see me as, I guess, should I call it victim, Jed?
Sure.
Or a bad example of not being the first to file. But the good news is all the labs were doing it, and we also sued Laboratory Corporation of America. They paid back $187 million. Once again, I wasn't the first to file, but we reached negotiated settlement, so I wound up with enough money to ultimately buy a beach house. So I didn't make out badly on that. And I get this letter from the FBI commending me for my citizenship and all of this, and I'm thinking, you know, I would have paid the government to go after these people. I was so mad. They'd gotten the law changed, and they basically corrupted medicine. And if you go to med school or any professional school, there's a vetting process. And so you work hard to get there. So why would you presume that a doctor is any more dishonest than anybody else? And if we're ordering too many tests, you should be able to tell it. Anyway, it was kind of an interesting foray. I learned a fair amount. We fast forward, this was in the early 90s. In 96, I would order one drug and another drug would be given to the patient. And since I followed them in the nursing home and the hospital, I noticed subtle mental status changes. They become confused. If they got an IV, they wouldn't wake up. One of them was my uncle. He was in ICU, and he didn't wake up until we stopped the Pepsi. Pepsi was, and I'd also spent 10 years at Tulane studying drugs. Drugs are, they're dumb. They don't do just what they're told to do. They also have side effects, which you found. And so Pepsi would cause confusion. It had central nervous system side effects. Anybody who's taken a Benadryl and gotten confused knows that. So I wrote to I said, how are you doing this? I'm ordering one drug, I'm the doctor, you're giving another drug. And they told me, oh, the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee has passed this. So some committee in the hospital got to override the patient's attending physician. And, oh, excuse me. So I said, that's crazy. And over 3 years, I'd written to them and said, don't do it under any circumstances. They kept doing it. So I documented it, I got drug levels, and what we found was that in certain patients, the levels were extremely high, associated with mental status changes. Out of frustration and as a last resort, I got an emergency room doctor who was also a lawyer, and we filed a federal false claims suit against Merck. And they thought we were crazy because Merck is God. I mean, if you look up the history of Merck, one of the most admired companies in the United States, their drug Pepsi came to the market late, so nobody was going to use it. And Zantac had the market. And I said to these guys, my lawyers, you know, we may beat Merck on the false claim, but we'll never beat them on the science. And I collected my side effects, and we went and met with a federal judge. The trouble with the False Claims Act is it's tough to get rich quick. They go on for years. They may go on for 10 years, and bodies may accumulate while this is going on. And I said, I don't want to be responsible for dead people because I'm filing a false claims action to make money. So we met with the judge. The judge said, do what you would normally do if there wasn't a lawsuit. To his credit, Judge Barbier. So I put it all together. I brought a packet such as this to my congressman who went to church. He was in the front of the church. I'm in the back, kind of low key. And he brought it up to the head of post-marketing surveillance, Janet Woodcock at the FDA. I'm thinking nothing's going to happen. I get called up to Washington. They give me the new package insert, which says, in elderly people, their kidney function is much worse than it appears to be because you measure it by a substance made by the muscles, creatinine. So then they issued a warning. It was published in JAMA. Went back to the hospitals, told them not to do it. We went to the Board of Medical Examiners, and the U.S. Attorney said, is it legal? And so we wrote to them, and the Board of Medical Examiners said, no, it's not legal. For a prescription to be legal, it's got to be written by a doctor for a specific patient taking care of, the doctor take care of the patient. So it was per se illegal. I bring that over to the hospitals, and they ignored it. And one of my friends was head of the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. They ignored him and canceled the meeting of the committee. We appealed, they appealed to the Board of Medical Examiners. We went with them. They lost the appeal. They still did it. I got my representative who had a board member, a sheriff on the board at East Jefferson Hospital, and he finally got him to stop doing it. We had some trouble because the government wasn't interested in the case. And that's another problem, you're dealing with government that may or may not be interested. But what ultimately happened, and then we got Senator Grassley. Grassley's an amazing guy. He writes a letter to the Attorney General basically saying, I understand you're not doing anything. Bring the guy that's not doing anything into my office. I want this within 2 weeks. And next thing I know, I had my own FBI agent, and they took it seriously. The hospital was very corrupt. They replaced independent doctors with stooges that were dependent on the hospital, had contracts with the hospital, and would rubber stamp anything. I lucked out because we had a little weather problem known as Katrina. As usual, I volunteered to stay, and administration, I had to evacuate some nursing home patients out of New Orleans. Administration said, you're not staying with us, are you? By then I'd already been to the Department of Justice and the FBI, so they really didn't want me around. So when I came back in that night, they said, we're in lockdown, nobody in, nobody out. You might know what the hospital memorial, because there was a little book written by a lady who won the Pulitzer Prize, Dr. Sherry Fink, called 5 Days of Memorial. It's a good read, and then they turned it into an Apple series. And basically, they replaced the doctors that were taking care of the patients with doctors they could control, and there were problems that occurred. Ultimately, Pepsid, Vioxx, and Zocor, which were, they basically bribed the pharmacists, settled for $570 million. They were doing the same thing with a drug called Protonix, and that one settled for $785 million, where they would give deep discounts to the hospital in exchange for market share. What they were doing was buying outpatient market share, and then they would, instead of giving it to Medicaid for 10 cents a pill, Medicaid would pay full price. So Medicaid was the target of the scam. They made a technical error because they bundled the IV and PO together, these Ivy League people. And when they did that, it came out of an exemption known as the charitable exemption. So it was an interesting journey. I did one more involving a medical device company where they got control of the ordering of IVs and thought it was a great idea to put 2 feet of plastic into somebody instead of a little catheter, and that caused all sorts of complications. That went nowhere as a false claim, but Centers for Medicare and Medicaid found a way to penalize hospitals if they got a complication from that. And I think I'm retired, unless of course I go after some no good HMO that's denying skilled and rehab.
Well, thanks for that story, Bill. Brian, tell us your story.
Sure. So I was, when I attended Goizueta, I was a pharmaceutical rep down here for Eli Lilly. And Lilly eventually, right around the time I was finishing up my business school degree, I transferred to Indianapolis, and then I came out as a sales manager, and then I moved over to their oncology division. So I was an oncology sales rep in Miami, and sold a chemotherapy drug called Alimta. And one of my competitors was Genentech's Tarceva. So I'd known I thought Tarceva was an amazing drug because in my studies I found out that in certain people they did really well. And they said that, and Lilly trained us that these were never smokers. So when I was with Lilly, we would talk about how if someone has a cigarette pack, give them Alimta, and save the never smokers for Tarceva. Sort of the way pharmaceutical world tries to segment competitors and sell your drug for a bigger competitor. So that was kind of my start of learning about Tarceva. I eventually moved over in Miami to work for Genentech. Went to the competition, and at the time, I don't know if you all know about this, but Genentech was almost like a legendary status. From 95, it really wasn't it wasn't a Merc. And then all of a sudden by 2000, I think 2008-ish, when I moved over there, it was had a whole culture around it. It was biotech. It was US biotech was Genentech. It was this amazing story, and I wanted to be a part of that story. So this was like a dream job for me. So I got this job in Miami, and I was a really good Toshiba salesperson. Now I'm sharing this with you because this is an interesting sort of an eye-opener for me. So we have the sales pitch or sales brochure based on what they call subsets. So I'm going to use a very technical phrase, and I won't do this too many times because I don't want eyeballs to start rolling over. But exploratory subset, retrospective exploratory subset analysis. And the source of these data was data on file. So just keep this, if you take anything away from my discussion, remember, data on file, okay? And if you see retrospective exploratory subset analysis, just in general, that means do not read it. It doesn't mean anything. It's fake news. If it says exploratory analysis, it means fake news, okay? It means there's no scientific value to what you're seeing because the study wasn't shown to present that. But that was our lead. That was our lead marketing piece. And I was good at this. I was one of the top sales reps in the nation. I had some great relationships down there. And I was talking to a doctor who had done some training in Memorial Sloan Kettering. And I had a bigwig from marketing with me. So I had this piece. And so we were talking about not never smokers, like I learned about at Lilly. We were talking about women with adenocarcinoma, which is a tissue type. And these are what they called like the subsets. And then they would call them another word for medically phenotypes, the phenotypes. So the reason you would show these subsets is because there's a Kaplan-Meier curve is a curve it's actually a survival curve, and basically shows over time how many people are still alive in a trial, and at the end, everybody sadly for these late-stage cancer drugs, everybody's dead. It's sad. So with Tarceva, for the overall market, for the broad population in the trial, there was only about 2 months benefit, 4 months for placebo. It was tested against placebo versus 6. And there was a little skinny benefit, and that's what the FDA label was on. But if you went into these subsets, the difference was significant to an oncologist, and they were looking for separation in the curves, as a term. So I went to this doctor who had done training with Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I'm with the marketing guy. And, Miami's a very friendly area. And the doctor said, "Get that out of my face! Get that junk out of my face!" It was like eye-opening for me. Because I respected this doctor, and we had a friendly relationship. So I said, "Sorry, doctor, I'll leave." And then, the marketing guy was like, "All right, what happened? I don't know, what's going on there? I don't know. Maybe he had a bad day." So I went back and spoke to the doctor, and he told me that you shouldn't base clinical decisions on these subsets. That's not what the trial was designed to do. And in fact, for the drug Tarceva, he said there's significant data that these subsets you're talking about, are actually people most likely to have these mutations that you can test for. And here's all the studies on this. This is probably in 2007. Here's all the studies. So when I started to get questions from my customers, I would send in medical requests for the company to send those studies to the doctors. And I had doctors coming to me saying, "Oh my God, you're changing my practice. I've got people who were really suffering with lung cancer. Now they tested positive. I did the test with the lab, and they're doing great." So that was my, and then I got promoted to go inside. So that was my background in this world. Well, it turns out that around the time when I went to, so when you're in marketing for these big companies, you get access to brilliant doctors. Like, what's great about being a pharmaceutical rep, you talk to physicians like Bill all day long. And they're such bright people, they care so much about people, and you learn so much. And when you're in these marketing positions, you also get opportunities to meet like researchers too. So, and you go to like ASCO is a big meeting, the huge meeting. So I remember going to ASCO when I was this is my dream job, and we've got the biggest booth, like Genentech's got a booth the size of the building at ASCO, it's amazing. And all the doctors are talking about is how Tarceva and Arisa, a drug like it, are like breakthroughs for lung cancer. There was a study done by a doctor out of Korea, I believe, at Inouye, Inouye, Dr. Inouye, and a doctor out of Philly, Dr. Corey Langer, did an editorial in Journal of Clinical Oncology about this study. It's a small study in late-stage cancer patients, probably like patients that Bill would treat, patients too sick to get chemo. And they sequenced the drugs, they sequenced their tumor, and they gave these people that are pretty much on their deathbed these drugs. If they had the mutation. The median survival, the progression-free survival for these people was 17 months. 17 months. So this is what I want you to understand. So these drugs, this Dr. Corey Langer, the title of the study, the title of his paper was The Lazarus Effect. And if you know the Bible, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And this is a phrase, I guess, that physicians use when they see this a miraculous effect. So here's a study showing, and these are these are patients that doctors would quit on. There were several males, so usually doctors would only think women had this mutation. There were several smokers too. So these are patients who normally would not have gotten this request for to sequence their tumor because they didn't meet the phenotypical characteristics of a person with this mutation. So this is the problem that existed in 2009. The problem that existed in 2009 is there was no FDA indication for the drug to be used with this mutation analysis, if that makes sense. So you've got patients, just to put things in perspective, this is like Lazarus effect. So if you can be on your deathbed with lung cancer and all the suffering that goes along with that. It's like dying of suffocation slowly. And then you've got chemo, you've got brain metastasis, bone metastasis, one of the most miserable ways to die. And there's this miracle, Lazarus miracle, and the FDA did not have an indication for the drug to be used like that. It was just used for people late stage cancer. So I was a marketer, I came back running in, I said, wait a minute. And there were other studies too, everything was popping with these drugs. Doctors from ASCO were so excited. I said, wait a minute, why don't we talk about this? This is my drug, our drug. Why aren't we talking about this miracle that they're talking about at ASCO? So I had a boss put me on the project, and I started to develop marketing materials around this. That was maybe a year and a half project. And then then there was a new director came in, a new boss came in. Long story short, I was thwarted. They basically said, that isn't the strategy. And I wouldn't let it go. I'd be the guy in the meeting that said, that is wrong. Our strategy's wrong. Our strategy's based on subsets that aren't. I was just that guy in the meeting. And it was very painful to be that guy in corporate America. So I eventually, I don't want to take this, my career took a really bad path from there. There was one meeting where I went to the head of regulatory and I said, because all of our marketing was based on these subsets. So I went to the head of the regulatory, and I said, they're not letting me talk about the mutations because they say it's not in the FDA label, but this is how our drug works. I was just at ASCO. Here's the Lazarus paper. This is all the data showing this is how these drugs work. And these drugs had gotten to market in 2004, and in 2004, that's when doctors from Memorial Sloan Kettering and Harvard said, look, this is how the drugs work. So this is like 2009, this is 5 years later. 2010-ish. So it wasn't part of the strategy. It wasn't our strategy. It's not in the label. Go to regulatory. She says, where does this data on file come from? Because we've been rubber stamping this for years. Where's this data on file? So I'm in a little room of marketers and She says, so does anyone know where this even came from? We don't even know the data. We just have like a little printout with like subsets. So some guy says, can I email something to you? He emails this to us, and it's a memo from the person with OSI Labs who was with it was a co-promotion, saying memo regarding subsets for marketing. Subsets should not be used to make clinical decisions. And then it says, the people most likely to benefit from these drugs are the people most likely to have an EGFR mutation. So this is exactly what I've been fighting for. I go to my marketing director, and then I ask for a, long story short, I ask for a transfer. I get the transfer. Soon enough, somebody says I'm bipolar in my performance management review, and then I'm out the door. And I was mad. I called, I looked up, and Jeb was my attorney, and I remember I had to take out a 401k loan just to cover my house payment for 2 months. And I was like a career, what is that, like purgatory and personal crisis mode. My poor wife was along for all this. So I had no job. I ended up hustling, figuring things out, starting my own business, but it was a bad route forward. And then, long story short, we file with the DOJ. DOJ picks up the case. While our case was going on, they eventually changed the guidelines for EGFR mutations. Then, 3 weeks after we settled our case, Genentech sends what they call a Dear Healthcare letter saying that only people with the mutation should get the drug. So I think we help patients, I hope, going back to what they, there's correlation, I don't know if there's causation, but that's where we are today, and now I'm happy to be here and talk more about it.
Thank you, Brian. Jed?
Yeah, I really appreciate, Paul, you having us here, Brian, Bill, always appreciate presenting with you guys. So these are my heroes, without a doubt. These are the people that inspire me, right? These are people who stand up against the Goliaths of the world, and they are the reason I do what I do. But I want to take you back to why I became a whistleblower attorney, because it's a story I don't tell a lot, but I think there's some lessons in there, especially for those who are in the Jones program for ethics. So I'll sprinkle in some stuff in there for that part of the audience. So after I graduated from undergrad, I had the dream job for anybody who loves college sports. So I worked for one of the largest banks in the world, and my job was to travel the country and to interact with universities that our bank had affinity relationships with. So if you got a University of Notre Dame credit card, it was actually issued by my bank, and the University of Notre Dame received a percentage of the money that was processed through that card. We had 184 universities. So I was traveling all the time. My first year with the bank, I traveled 212 of the 365 days. So I was constantly traveling, and I spent most of that time attending football games and basketball games and volleyball games and just interacting with university presidents and athletic directors to make sure that they were happy with the way the program was going, see if there's anything that I could do to help them. I was basically a concierge between the bank and the universities. One day, on a Monday, I came back and I came into our marketing department meeting, a room a little bit smaller than this. And as I came in the room, the marketing director, the EVP of our marketing department, asked me to close the door, that we were having an emergency meeting because we had misreported our numbers to the market. And what he told us was the next day we were going to re-report our numbers. We're being acquired by another bank, and the fact that we had misreported our numbers was a big problem. Likely was going to lead to SEC investigations, and that we would want to make sure that everybody was aware that if you got phone calls from securities attorneys or the Wall Street Journal or whatever, that you want to route them to a particular number. counsel's office, right? That we shouldn't be, as marketing directors, talking about, problems with spreadsheets. That's not our job at the time. My immediate supervisor, before the meeting was done and before the markets closed at 4, left the meeting and sold every share she had in the bank, was tried, convicted, and sentenced for insider trading. I was promoted, and I was sent to a 3-day course to teach me how to terminate people. So I was in the department of 8. I was told that we had to downsize by 2. I was 22 years old. I was the low man on the totem pole, but I was told that I had to identify 2 people to lay off. And they taught me how to do this, right? It's not you, it's us, it's kind of like a breaking up of the girlfriend, but it's just kind of this like gentle thing, and it was a 3-day course on how to fire someone. And I didn't know how to do it, so I put everybody by seniority. Everybody had been there longer than me, and I said the bottom 2 people were the 2 people that recommend getting fired. They told us if somebody had just come forward and identified the problem with our numbers, that all of this would have been avoided, and that we would have had the problem that we had, and the bank that was acquiring us would have been upset, the market would have been upset, and the market was upset. Our stock price dropped by $40. It went from like 64 to 24 overnight. So the market was very, very upset about what happened. And they said that what they were going to do to remedy this problem was they're going to put an email system that if you email the problem, it's going to encrypt who it's coming from, but the email itself, the body of the email will go through. So it was like a way to anonymously report problems. The next Monday, they called us all back together in the same room, and they said, "Can Terry come to the front?" And they asked my friend Terry to come to the front, and they said, "Terry, I just want to thank you for using our email system. We appreciate you raising your concerns to us." I grew up in Kentucky. It's called hanging a coyote on the fence. You hang the body of the coyote to discourage other coyotes from coming around. Terry was reassigned to another office, and then within 6 months was gone. It was soon after that meeting I signed up for a Princeton review course to take the LSAT and to go to law school. I was so bothered that there really wasn't an avenue for people who saw a wrong to step forward and receive protection. This was pre-WorldCom, pre-Enron, pre-Madoff. There really wasn't anything in existence. So I went to law school specifically to study whistleblower laws and litigation. My thought was maybe I could help something out on the Hill, and then I discovered in law school, and soon after, this thing that Bill was talking about and Brian was talking about, the False Claims Act, which allows a private citizen to report fraud happening, and they're incentivized to do it, and there's protections. And soon after, Madoff happened, and WorldCom and Enron, all these things led to similar whistleblower programs for the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, the National Highway Transportation Act. There's 30 state false claims acts. All this happened within the last 20 years, all happened during my career. But when I think about, what could have happened over 20 years ago when I was at the bank, it's the same thing that happens in Brian's case, and Bill's case, and all the different clients that I've had, is that it's usually a top-down business plan-driven fraud that many people identify, but few people have the courage to step forward. Brian's case, Brian wasn't the only person that recognized what happened. Bill's a physician. There's other physicians that see what happened, but few step forward. So what I oftentimes focus on is, why do people step forward when they step forward, and why do companies do wrong? And what oftentimes I see is that the reason why people like Brian and Bill step forward is because they have a moral compass, right? Many of my clients live by a moral code that many people don't, right? They're the people who see a wrong and they can't let it go. Did you hear what Brian said? He was the person in the meeting, the annoying person, was like, wait a second, that's wrong. That's the common thread. These are people who are tenacious truth tellers, that when they see a wrong, they can't let it go. And then the companies that have a moral compass that's broken, it's usually somebody at the top who, whether through justification or rationalization or pure greed, drives the company off course. And many times, employees are along for the ride, and it takes courageous people like Bill and Brian to say, wait a second, this isn't the company I want to work for. We got to go back on course. And for those companies that don't listen, and they alienate, isolate, and terminate people like this, then they become whistleblowers.
Wow. So, let's talk about that moral compass for a minute, because I'm an ethicist, and that's what we try to teach people. So, I mean, Bill, you said that partially the reason that you did it was driven by anger or resentment, upsetness about how you were treated. Human motivations are complex. So as you began to do this, as you began to try to right this wrong, how did you think about it? What were you telling yourself? Did you think of yourself as fighting the good fight? Did you think of yourself as trying to fulfill your obligation, your Hippocratic oath as a physician? What was your self-concept about this?
Well, doing extra lab work isn't going to hurt a patient, so it's not do no harm.
Right.
It is going to hurt the program because money spent on that will not be spent on other things. I was outraged that our government let these drug companies buy up the labs and then commit systematic fraud. So, to be honest, the labs really angered me, and then when that idiot decided to sue me, my subchapter S company, which he couldn't win, he was only trying to harass. And around that time, I think we had the movie Trading Places, and I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice? And I happen to have a retired federal judge and a politically connected firm, and they agreed that, hey, I'm playing by the rules, these other people need to play by the rules too. So the labs were interesting. The Pepsi case was more problematic because I saw the damage that was happening on a daily basis, and I'm the guy that went to med school, and I spent time at the Charity Hospital Intensive Care as a fellow, and I knew that this class of drugs could cause mental status changes. And the Pharmacy and Therapeutic Committee, which were controlled by the pharmacist, was basically motivated by money. We couldn't control them. And so that one was like, holy shit, this is really harming patients. Something has to be done. So I didn't want to do it. But at that point, I noticed that the companies, Tenet, even the not-for-profits, were basically so corrupt. They knew that what they were doing was illegal. They did it anyway. There's always kind of, maybe we were just talking, we're both wrestlers, and so we were wrestling with these people. But fortunately for us, we had an 800-pound gorilla, the Department of Justice, that we went to send out Senator Grassley, who helped us. We went to other folks who helped us. And we were able to recruit a team that all were outraged by it. But then we had the stooge doctors that would go along with anything and didn't get bothered at all, so long as they got what they wanted. And the pig case was interesting because I collected about 100 serious complications, blood clots, infections, and I'd come to work and I'd get a note by a nurse saying, we've determined that the patient needs a PICC. A PICC is a central line. And I was trained, don't put foreign bodies in people, they get infected and clot. Well, they blew right past that one. And that was very interesting because I presented what I had to the quality person, doctor with CMS. And I put my data, gave her my data. That was tricky because you couldn't find the complications unless you looked at it a certain way, which she did. Once she found them, she said, okay, you want to put them in? You're going to wind up eating the cost of the complication. We wound up, and we didn't do well in court. The judge cut out a number of key parts to our case. But one of the worst parts about the pig case was Bard, the company, lied to the FDA about the size of it. It was bigger than they said it was. The bigger the catheter, the more likely you are to get a thrombosis. So we ultimately, I had the case in Boston, which Justice Department was helping us on, and we figured that we'd gotten the information to the Medicare, and we weren't getting help from DOJ, so we dropped the big case, but there was no recovery, but I think we were able to avoid a lot of patient harm.
So, Brian, you talk about Genentech as being this star in the firmament of companies at that time. Yes, they were making a lot of money by suggesting Tarceva should be used for everybody instead of just for the people with mutations, but they were putting so much on the line. Why would they do it?
Oh, this is a great question, because it doesn't make sense, because they had other drugs. They had a full, you had Rituxan, you had Herceptin, you had Avastin at the time, that were all blockbuster cancer drugs. If you went to, like I was a drug rep for Tarceva, there was me, there was 2 Avastin reps, there were Herceptin reps. So if you look at any given, like let's say an oncologist, I'm visiting Dr. LaCourte, we would see him collectively like every other day at least. So we were in there almost all the time. It's a good question. The history of these drugs, Iressa and Tarceva, these EGFR mutation drugs, so it's basically Iressa hits the market, and immediately Memorial Sloan Kettering and Harvard, Mass General figure it out and say, oh my God, this is a miracle. These patients are, the tumors are disappearing. And we sequence their tumor, they've got these mutations, boom, publish it. Like this is the top cancer institutions, maybe MD Anderson is not included, but in the US. And what happened? Nothing happened for almost a decade with regards to this EGFR mutation testing. So then the question is, how did Genentech benefit from, the standard, this is what I was thinking about on my drive up here. So the standard of care is very important in cancer care, because all the research is based on standard of care. That's your control arm. Your control arm, if they don't get standard of care, it's an unethical trial, right? Because patients are consenting to getting less than standard of care. So what happened in this decade-ish of cancer care, like 03, 04 till, let's say, really 2015 until the community, you basically had a standard of care at Memorial Sloan Kettering and Mass General and these other institutions where they, at least, if you had the phenotypical characteristics, female with adenocarcinoma, never smoker, they would sequence your tumor. If it popped with the mutation, you got Iressa Tarceva. If you were in the community where drug reps were the primary source of education, you weren't getting sequenced tumors. You were getting chemo and maybe Avastin or something like that. And doctors made money off chemo. Doctors made money off of Avastin. They would stock it, and they would, with Medicare, they would charge it up, or Medicaid. They would be able to make a premium, a percentage on that. When you gave it, when doctors gave you a pill, the doctors didn't make any money unless they had like their own pharmacy, which was not many doctors. So getting back to your earlier question, it's a good question to ask, really the whole cancer community. Like, what the hell were you doing from 2004 to 2012? Why did you allow the community to have one standard of care and the ivory towers to have another standard of care? And why didn't you adjust that standard of care in the clinical trials for drugs you brought to market? There were billions of dollars of drugs brought to market that had no sequencing of the tumor involved. Alimta is one of them, Avastin is one of them, Erbitux is one of them. We're talking Eli Lilly, Genentech, Imclone, are 3 companies. And my wife works for Eli Lilly, so they probably don't want me saying this. But what were why were they able to choose, was it because the FDA gave them the ability to choose, I think, a substandard standard of care? Because if you went to Memorial Sloan Kettering, they would, definitely if you were never a smoker, they would sequence your tumor. But that wasn't what they were doing throughout the 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, up until we had these immune checkpoint inhibitors like Keytruda. That was not what was happening in these clinical trials. So going back, I'm sorry to ramble, but why? Nobody's asked that question of the academic community, the pharmaceutical community, the regulatory community. Why did you allow two standards of care to occur? I think, and this is not just a key point. So Genentech in one of the quotes said they did everything legal and everything was proper. And I think this is something that I think a business school focus. It seems that the laws protecting shareholders are actually stronger, this isn't related to Genentech, just in general, are stronger than the laws protecting patients. So that, it just seems that way. Because I don't know how an entire industry, it's almost like emperor's new clothes. How did entire industry, all these institutional review boards, pharmaceutical ethics committees, Center for Medicare Services, FDA, National Cancer Institute, how could they just ignore this breakthrough from Harvard and Memorial Sloan Kettering? I don't know the answer, Paul, but I gave you a long answer and I didn't give you an answer.
So Jim,
Yeah.
so Brian has an N of 1, right? He had this
Yeah.
one experience with Genentech. Bill is at 4, 5, 6. I don't know how many, Bill. You're such a well-known whistleblower that maybe it's gone into double figures. But you, 12. Really, 12? Is that a real number? Wow, amazing. But you, of course, you've had many, many clients, so you've seen sort of a broader swath of this phenomenon. What's your assessment of how this actually works, why these companies, the penalty for being caught seems so severe, why the risk?
So, Bill and Brian are part of a cadre of whistleblowers. We get together as a group. We got together last week in which we talk about our stories. The Enron whistleblower, the WorldCom whistleblower, the Madoff whistleblower, Brian and Bill and a whole bunch of others get together, and in their stories you start to identify some common threads and some common trends. And the Enron whistleblower, I interviewed her for my show. She said something that I think is pretty illustrative of what we see across the industries. Is she said, the Enron fraud that everybody identifies really was the second fraud. The first fraud happened much earlier. It was a smaller, kind of touched their toe into the water and they got away with it. And then they did the same thing on a bigger scale. And I think that's what happens is a lot of times they'll do something and sometimes by accident, sometimes by commission or omission, and they're like, oh wow, that really worked. And we got away with it. Or if we were caught, the penalty really didn't match. It became a cost of doing business. We paid an SEC fine or we paid a False Claims Act settlement, but think of in Tarceva, the amount of money that they made off of this drug, marketing it for the general population and then niche themselves down to EGFR positive. By doing that, they made a lot more money than the $67 million they paid in Brian's case. Now, the reputational harm was huge for Genentech, but setting that aside, the dollars and cents became, it was a profit center. But I think a lot of times that's what it is. It's we got away with speeding 55 in a 50 mile per hour zone. Well, I'll go to 60. And then all of a sudden you're doing 70 until you get a speeding ticket. And then all of a sudden you're, a Boy Scout driving down the street at the speed limit for a little bit longer. Then all of a sudden you find yourself creeping up. I think that's usually what happens is they see the benefit of it when they're caught. If the deterrent value isn't strong enough, they're going to continue doing it. And certainly if nobody ends up wearing orange at the end of the day, then there's no personal impact with someone saying, wait a second, we really shouldn't do what we're doing here.
So let me ask one last question before I open it up, because this has always interested me, and I'm just curious about all three of your opinions. So I was on a committee of the National Academies of Science that rewrote the book Responsible Science, which is kind of the Bible of scientific misconduct. And it was written in '92, and now it was in 2020s, it was late teens. And it was obsolete because science had changed so much since the 1992. But when we read over that first book, it was what I call the bad apple theory of scientific misconduct. The reason there's scientific misconduct is because that guy decided to, make his data fraudulent so that he could advance his career. And we changed the major description to say the reason that there's scientific fraud is because institutions give scientists all kinds of incentives to engage in fraud. So there's the bad apple theory, and then there's the institutional structure and pressure theory. And I'm just curious whether you think of the kinds of fraud you've seen as being more because some CEO said, we're going to make a lot of money and we're going to initiate this fraud, or because the institution as an institution had enormous institutional pressures to either make money or pressures on particular employees to make quotas or something else that drove that fraud forward. Or both.
It's funny because I did study business and medicine through Johns Hopkins, and if you start getting into quality issues, and there's common cause and special cause. I think you're moving away from special cause over to common cause, and fraud is something that maybe I don't know if I'm cynical, but I was amazed at the number of doctors that had no problem with this. And we all want to fit in our organizations. And one of these days I'll publish a book called Malprocess. And there's malpractice where an individual practitioner screws up, maybe 2 or 3 of them. Malprocess is when the process is rotten and everybody screws up. And you're right in the sense that you wind up with incentives. The utilization review people in hospitals want short length of stay. So everybody jumps on board with short length of stay. And they'll do all sorts of things to get a short length of stay. Sometimes not bothering to make sure that the discharge is safe. And I think, this is a scary thought. Why did all those people go along with Hitler? I don't think they were inherently bad people to that extent. But it's amazing what happens with peer pressure and institutional pushing things in bad acting.
Right?
I think there's 2 aspects to this. The first aspect, I think you have doctors, scientists, not just at Genentech, at the FDA. I would say relying on the processes or the FDA says this is the standard, so we'll go with the FDA, right? That's the ethical standard. That's not the ethical standard. That's what a bureaucracy said was the standard. That doesn't mean that's the ethical standard. And I think that you get that across the board. Well, that's the FDA indication, even though in your own institution you've got a whole different standard than that FDA indication. Well, that's the FDA indication, so let's just go with the FDA indication. And I don't know why the FDA did what they did, but that they're probably saying, well, we have this process, and that's what the company submitted. That was the trial. That's our process. So we stick to our process. So around the institutional world, I think you can, and within a company, well, this is what's regulatory approved. I've got lawyers, I've got regulatory experts. It's easy to, and I don't want to, I'm going to say this, it's easy to outsource your ethics to the processes, to the institutions. Well, if they say it's good, then it's good. Who am I to challenge that? That's the process. Maybe I don't want to go against the process, even though if I think it's wrong, because who am I? I think that went on times thousands in this case. The other thing, and then this is what I'm going to say here is I think whenever you see stock prices of companies rocket like that, what you are seeing is risk being rewarded. Because the markets are, when you keep growing like that, when you see a stock growing like that, a big stock growing like that, it means that the company it means that the market is rewarding them for risks they took. And more risks they took, and more risks they took, and more risks they took. So it's like, wow! It's like I'm playing blackjack and I'm always winning. Geez, how's this guy always winning? Well, I think there was a video I saw with Sue Desmond-Hellman, who was in charge of R&D for Genentech at the time. And she made it very clear in this video that they bet the farm on Avastin. And it's clear if you look at Avastin sales. So Avastin was one failed phase 3 away from that legend never happening. Never happening. And that phase 3 was probably the lung cancer study in 2005. Tarceva hit the market right before that, and this breakthrough in EGFR mutations happened before that. So the company could have said, we're going to change the study, we need to sequence for mutations. They did it. Now, and then, they were rewarded, because right now, if you look at cancer care, nobody's talking about angiogenesis. Like that's what Avastin was. It choke the tumor, stop the blood vessels from the tumor, and it's all about immune checkpoint inhibitors. So you had this breakthrough from 2004 to 2005 that resulted in a $46 billion buyout from Roche, and now science has basically given up on that breakthrough. I mean, what happened there? Like I said, this is Brian. This is just everything I'm saying right now is correlation, not causation. But when you see a stock rising like that, how do they always win? And that's the question I'm asking. How do you always win? And I think this is a fair question to ask. They ask it if I was winning, if I went to Biloxi and was playing, they would say, how is Brian always winning? And I'm asking that of Genentech now. How did you always win during that time period? And I don't know. That's my answer. Jim?
So I love incentives, like studying incentives. I mean, the whistleblower programs that we talk about, False Claims Act, the SEC, IRS, CFTCs, all these work in large part because we're incentivizing integrity and providing protections to whistleblowers, providing them rewards so that if they step forward and risk their careers, right? It's hard for Brian to get a job at a pharmaceutical company as a sales rep again. Right? It's hard for people when they get blackballed. So we have to give them enough incentive to say they're going to risk their careers by stepping forward. Same thing on the other side. Like, what is incentivizing a company to do what they do? I've been in many companies for depositions where I walk through the lobby and I look up and chiseled on marble in the lobby is their ethic code or their mission statement. It all sounds beautiful. And then in the depositions, you hear about the CEO driving sales over patient need or driving people to do unethical things because they have a dollar amount that they want to hit in order to get their bonuses. So what you say and what's in your lobby is one thing, but what are the incentives that you have in place that drives the conduct underneath you in the org chart? So I think you're right. I think it is industry driven. I think it's shareholder driven to a large extent. Shareholders wanting return on their dollars. They're not looking for return on, I feel better because you have an ethical company, but that doesn't put my children through college. You got to make sure you drive that dollar amount up. As Brian says, that stock price needs to go up. But one thing I've learned over my career is, if water is always flowing upstream, it's usually getting pumped. And if it's consistently flowing upwards, it's probably fraud that's driving it. And usually it's because it's incentivized.
All right, so I want to open up to questions from the floor. Please raise your hand high because I'm at your eye level. Yes, I see your high hand, green sleeve.
Hey, so about the off-label marketing pieces, like this is a question more from Mr. White.
Yeah.
You've been involved in a bunch of those, it seems.
Yeah.
it seems like maybe 10 years ago, almost every major pharmaceutical company was getting hit by these. And then it tapered off. And is that because it was a policy decision in terms of prosecutors saying, okay, we're going to ease off, or is the industry getting more careful about their marketing practices?
Great question. I think we have an industry person in the room. I love it. Brian's was the last off-label marketing case that settled in 2016. And the reason, there's many reasons. There was a case that came out of the Second Circuit that raised the argument that sales reps have a First Amendment right to basically lie or to promote off-label uses.
Are you talking about the Corona?
I am, that's correct. The Justice Department has pointed to that as one of the reasons why they don't want to push hard on off-label. There have been other cases that may not be off-label, but it's false and misleading information leading to inappropriate claims is kind of the way that we're trying to shoehorning it in. Most of the cases now are kickback violations in the pharmaceutical world. But you're absolutely right. It's this concern about this Second Circuit. Again, there's 11 circuits. One circuit court decision the Justice Department's pointing to. But with that being said, if the Justice Department's not interested in our case, they decline to take over the case, we can go forward without it. And if the case is egregious off-label marketing, for example, pediatric use for a drug that's only labeled for adults, I have no problem taking those cases forward because I'm concerned about pediatric uses for strong drugs. I take those cases and I'd take them forward without the Justice Department. Yeah.
I've noticed in my office, the drug reps are fairly conservative. They stick to the package insert, regardless of that hearing. One little nuance is if you can get to the pharmacist and affect his bonus with a market share agreement, saying if 90% of the people go on my drug, which lacks the FDA indication for 80% of the conditions, you're going off label by contract. And in my experience, the feds don't care much about that aspect of it.
It's about 20 years ago at Penn, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. The students actually started, medical students actually started a movement they called No Free Lunch, where the pharmaceutical companies before that had come in and they were all over the medical school all the time. And they would buy lunch for the medical students every day. The medical students could go into the lounge and there'd be pizza there from, Merck. And the students stopped it. They said, we've been taught that taking free stuff corrupts you, so why is our medical school allowing us to get all of this free food? And of course, it wasn't just the pizza. Next to the pizza was a drug rep who was then chatting with the students and trying to promote their drug. So, you hear both sides of this. Drug reps are important because doctors have to learn about emergent drugs. And then you hear drug reps corrupt because they're always pushing their drugs and they aren't always totally honest about the drug's uses. What is the proper role of drug reps and how much influence do they have over the formulary and the prescribing of drugs in our country?
They'll come into my office and they'll have a drug that I don't understand at all. And I say, well, if you want, you can get on our lunch schedule. And they'll buy lunch. If I really want to know about it, I'll buy lunch. Mm-hmm. It's kind of insulting to think that buying a doctor lunch is going to have much effect. If it does, then you've got to question yourself, what do you do with the hospitals that routinely buy lunch for doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners? We seem to have a fair amount of schizophrenia when it comes to some of these things. They go nuts. A drug company can't give me a pen. But a hospice, a home health company, a nursing home, they can all give me pens. So if it's a drug company, it magically will make me write that drug, which is crazy.
I think, if you just run your own business and you want to build a relationship with a potential client, it's hard to do. You take them to a ball game, you spend 3 hours with them, it's easier to do. And that's just the way business works in America and in the world. You know, if a doctor says, you know, you can take my time, but I need lunch out of it, I don't think that that's that big of a deal. What I think the FDA doesn't understand is when they create a label, you have an army of super effective people marketing to that label. So if this label is borderline not the standard of care, and there's science out there that competes with this label, I think the FDA should be quick to act. Because for every label you have, especially with the big companies, these reps are very effective. Because, I mean, Paul, just every day I'm going to say, let's say we had a discussion, you had a patient that reminded you of what I talked about. Well, do I have your commitment? I mean, what buddies? Do I have your commitment? I mean, you said this helps your patient, right? That's the conversation that's happening weekly with a doctor, with a really good sales rep. So, all right, I appreciate it. I've got your commitment now. And that's how they're trained. That's very effective. Well, if you think about it, like how many people in here, when was the last time someone said to you, do I have your commitment? Well, I mean, you rarely hear that. Imagine hearing this probably 4 or 5 times a week. Do I have your commitment? That's from very, very effective people, very effective communicators. That's what the FDA, I don't think, understands. You have an army of, there's like an army of, who's that guy, Tony Robbins? Yeah. So you have a label, and you're releasing Tony Robbins on the world with it. That's what's happening. And I don't think the FDA understands that.
So, my wife's a medical director at a hospital, and she has some very strict rules on sales reps coming into her hospital based on some of the stuff. It is effective, and you know, it depends on the physician. Bill has a moral compass, others don't. You know, there's been so many examples in the Novartis case that settled a couple years ago, in which it was a regular dinner at the Devon Seafood Grill, where the same doctors got together ostensibly to hear a sales pitch. In reality, it was just dinner. It's a dinner party every Friday with the same group of doctors, and Novartis picking up the tab. Or did that change their prescribing habits? Yes. Yes, it did change their prescribing habits. And I think that there's this change that's happened over the last 20 years. The old days of Super Bowl tickets and tickets to the Eagles football game or whatever those have gone, or that are now adopted by other industries outside of pharma. Some med device companies are certainly up to some of these old tricks. But you know, the reason they spend this money is because it works. Yeah.
I reached in my pocket thinking I'd find either a home health or a hospice pen. This is a surprise. Pastoral Care Week 2014. Spiritual Well-Being, the McFarland Institute.
You know those hospital chaplains, the hard sell.
I think I forgot a pen, and one of the hospital employees gave me this.
Questions? Edward.
Yeah, kind of a hard practical question. So, talking to all these people who are going to go out into the world, if they discovered something wrong and decided they were going to blow the whistle, shall we say, what would you tell them to do to kind of prepare and get ready and how to proceed? And maybe even want to make sure they didn't.
So what does the potential whistleblower have to know?
Should I start?
Go ahead.
I would suggest you handle it internally and continue to handle it internally. But you have to plan, well, if I do this and really piss these people off, I may get fired. I mean, that's a possibility. So, a false claim lawsuit is extremely difficult. It's protracted, you've got to deal with lawyers. And I remember one of the relators told me I had a problem with a doctor. He was doing crazy stuff. And I was ready to go after him. And she said, no, handle it this way. So if you can handle it in a civil, by that I mean courteous, professional manner, going through the usual mechanism of where you are, document, try and avoid anything that's overtly hostile, and if you cannot accomplish it that way, and there's really patient harm, you're gonna have to figure that out. Is it something that I want to go on the line and may lose a job on? Or if you're gonna file a lawsuit, understand these things take years, 5, 10. Your chances of success are not with you. I mean, the odds are against you. Does that answer the question?
I have so much respect for Bill, but I disagree with you here, Bill. That's okay. I think you should go through your career looking for whistleblower opportunities. The system will churn you out. The goal is to crush you. The stress is unbearable. You're going to put stress on your family that they will live with for the rest of their lives if you challenge the company every day. The system is built to chew you up and spit you out. This False Claims Act is it's a veil. It's like a guardian angel that Abraham Lincoln created. And if you work in an industry that supplies the government, you have this guardian angel. All you need to do is call the guardian angel, because otherwise you will get churned out. Chances are you're going to have physical, you'll be fat. Someone called me a walking heart attack the other day. I didn't like that. I'm working on my diet, but I mean, you don't want that. It's going to be tough on your family. You may lose a job. You're going to try to find a job. You're going to have insecurity trying finding a job. It's miserable, challenging the status quo in a big company. And this isn't just with whistleblower issues, it's with all issues. Anytime you challenge a boss, the system's built to churn you out. If you approach your job looking for whistleblower opportunities, and you say, I'm a fraud investigator, that's my job. I'm going to go through my life investigating fraud. You see something, you call Taxpayers Against Fraud, there's a whole list of them. I met a whistleblower who went through 4 or 5 law firms until we finally got one to take his case. Just go down the list. And then you know what? You go undercover. When we go to these little retreats, like everyone's doing well. Now, Bill's doing really well. I'm doing okay. But you see some people that are loaded. You know why they're loaded? They wore a wire. They wore a wire. I'm just letting you know. If you go through your career and say, you know, I'm going to do my job, and you come across fraud, you got to think, and remember, Brian's telling you this, I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to be a millionaire because of what they're doing. I'm going to call Taxpayers Against Fraud. I'm going to get my data. And you know what? I'm going to wear a happy face at work. I'm not going to be stressed. You got Kool-Aid? Give me more of that Kool-Aid. I'm drinking all your Kool-Aid, boss. I love it. I love it. You know what? Because it's going to take you a year maybe for the FBI and everyone to come around. Oh, yeah. I got a wire space right here. You want a camera? Here's a camera right here. Whatever you want, DOJ. I'm your special spy. And then you know what? You work on that case. Maybe you get another job. You get another whistleblower gig. And then like Bill says, they take a while. 10, 15 years, you're worth $100 million. And all you did was listen to Brian. You got no stress. No stress. Everybody's like, oh my God, he's a whistleblower? I didn't know that. Or you could go the other way. You could bang your head against the wall and let them crush you. I'm just letting you know. That's my life. You don't live that long on this earth. Don't spend 15 years of it in stress.
But Brian, I have a question for you about that. We just talked about all the whistleblowers for, you know, Enron and Madoff and all of them who never made a penny.
Yeah.
So what they could have been thinking they were going to be millionaires, but they're not. So how can
So Harry Markopoulos blew the whistle on Bernie Madoff. He learned his lesson. He's a multimillionaire right now, with more millions maybe coming. He's brilliant, and he's blown the whistle on boutique banks doing shady stuff in financial services. He calls himself a fraud investigator. And I'm just letting you know, the odds of you becoming an alcoholic, divorced, frustrated, fat, type 2 diabetes are really high if you buck the system. they're very, very high, or your family experiencing that stress, don't put it on yourself. You've got this guardian angel called the key tam relator case above your shoulder, and like Bill said, you bring that 10,000-pound gorilla called the DOJ to support you.
Okay, so we have two different visions here. Before I get back to Bill, we're going to ask our attorney to adjudicate this case. What should people do?
So I certainly remember Brian calling me. When I talk to new clients, I spend a lot of time trying to talk them out of becoming whistleblowers. In part because I want to make sure they have the fire in their belly that's going to see them through 6 years, 10 years, 15 years, that they understand all the horrible things that can happen. And I want to make sure it's a good relationship. Brian and I talk every day for many, many years. I talk to Brian more than I did my wife. Maybe I should seek counseling for that. Seek counseling too. But Brian is right in one regard. If you see that you're in a company that has top-down business plan fraud, raising your hand, be like, hey boss, I don't know if you realize, but what you're doing is wrong, and I know you know it's wrong, but I think it's wrong what you're doing. Blowing the whistle internally leads to a lot of bad things, is what I've seen over my career. But if you're working for a company that, sometimes it's not fraud. It is just, they're not aware of what they're doing, or there's a misunderstanding, or you don't quite see the rest of what's happening, right? I've had many times where people call, and what they think is fraud is not fraud. They just don't understand that there's an exception to Stark, or there's some part of what they perceive as fraud is actually right because it's covered by another department, or there's you're only exposed to so much when you work in a company. You may not fully see the picture. So there certainly has been many examples where people wanted to bring a case. If they brought the case, they were going to be blackballed from the industry, and I would have discouraged those people from filing a case to begin with, especially if the Justice Department is saying, we're going to lift the seal and your name's going to come out from under seal. Brian's case was different. He worked for a company that was showing obvious signs of knowing what they were doing was wrong, and they could care less about Brian, and they were going to retaliate against him, and they were going to make sure that they continued doing what they were doing. So it depends. Like every good lawyer, it depends.
It depends.
I've had longevity. I filed my first case in '93, and as a last resort, I guess I filed the drug and PIC line case. First thing I would do if you're considering filing is go to an experienced key tam law firm. You don't want some bozo that doesn't know what he's doing, filing a bunch of crap that's going to get unsealed, and then you don't know what kind of blowback you're going to get. And I think I'm relatively unscathed in terms of the family and the profession, but part of it is I set myself up to be independent. And I work around hospitals and nursing homes, and the people there are, for the most part, decent. The fear I have is somehow, like I had somebody come in last week, I'm medical director of a nursing home, and they sent a lab in there, and I don't know how much you guys know about some of this technical stuff. With a computer, they wanted me to sign an attestation saying that I'd authorized the lab work. And an attestation should be a test, individual test for an individual patient. They wanted a blanket, and my son talked to them, and they were going to do these crazy expensive lab tests with genetic testing. And I said to them, because the guy was doing it, I said, you don't understand, this is wrong. And I told them why it was wrong. I may get blowback, but I prefer to always try and reason and point out where the problem is. And then I called my healthcare lawyer, and he said, you're right, you can't sign that.
So, did you want to make that last, we'll give you the last quick comment, go ahead.
I would like to. So, my name is Ann Adams, and I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Emory Healthcare. You also have the Chief Compliance Officer for Emory University. Her name is Kenya Mann. And we have a Emory Trust line that you can concerns or an issue, you can do it anonymously. And I would encourage you, if you have an issue where you come in, I do think it's wrong to say come in and be the frost over your company, because I don't think that's the way in business should operate or employees should go about their job. But you may see something and you have a question, encourage you to go through your channels that you have internally in your organization. We've come a long way since the 90s. Most organizations have a compliance program. Most organizations have a compliance officer, and bring it forward. Let us try to do it internally. Don't just say, oh, send email to this address, and follow through. Give us all the information that you possibly have so that we can do a thorough investigation. And it's just like you said, it may be okay. We get a lot of questions too for guidance. Seek guidance too if you're concerned that you're not following the right rules or the right law. So that's what we're here for. So we'll do everything we can help.
One further comment, to take what you're saying further. I go to the hospital attorney, and she's an ally, and if I have a problem that's going on there, I trust her. She's also a nurse. We've known each other 30, 40 years, and I can't stress enough the benefits of trying to work it out and go internal. Now, I'm not dealing with genuinely evil people.
We're good people. We want to try to do the right thing. That's what we're here. We're trying to help you stay out of trouble of organizations.
And if they are truly evil, it's not, you might want to get the hell out of there. Or file your suit, then get the hell out of there.
thank
So,
you for the opportunity.
First of all, I'd like to thank our guests for traveling here and joining us. We have some light refreshments outside the door for all of you to engage in. Our guests will stay here and chat with you for a little while, so please join us out in the hallway.